Every year around this time, I feature one extraordinary life that was forever changed on the night of the 14th of April 1912. When that fateful night is ever brought up, we often think of the likes of Captain Smith, Bruce Ismay, the Guggenheims or the Astors. But it is the tale of a first-class stewardess that is one of the most extraordinary. There is nothing lucky about Violet Jessop's early life. She was born in 1887 in Argentina, after her parents emigrated there from Ireland. The majority of her early life was spent looking after her family and 8 siblings. Being the eldest, she was heavily relied upon, but one day she came down with tuberculosis. The doctors predicted she wouldn't survive the month, but amazingly, she pulled through. For 3 of her siblings, however, they were not so lucky, and they passed in infancy. When Violet was 16, her father passed away. Assuming the responsibilities over the large family, it was decided that the family moved back to England for better opportunities. Violet's mother was a stewardess, and it was hoped that there was more chance of work in the industrial ports on board the flourishing transatlantic ships. Violet knew that before there was any chance of getting on board, she needed an education. There was no chance of getting into colleges, so she attended a convent school to give her the basic skills she required. Sadly, before she could finish, her mother became ill, and seeing no other opportunity, Violet had to start applying for work to support her family. At the age of 21, Violet got her first appointment in 1908 on board the Orinoco. The ship was small and rather dated compared to the new liners that had been built in the Edwardian era and carried a mix of passenger and freight as well as mail. She was used mainly in the Caribbean, and it was ideal as a first-time occupation. The ship wasn't so small that you'd be tripping over people, but it wasn't too large or overwhelming. The stewardship would have lasted about a year, and it was likely that Violet was on board in the ship's final days before it was intentionally grounded in Scotland and scrapped. It is unclear if Violet took an interim job or hopped from ship to ship, but in 1911 Violet got a distinct upgrade. The Olympic, one of the largest ships of the age, was in need of a stewardess, and Violet fitted the bill. By comparison to the other ships built, the Olympic would have felt like a floating palace, and its beauty would have been second to none. On the 20th of September 1911, Violet was on board tending to her duties. The Olympic was preparing to leave Southampton, and it was another routine trip. As she was preparing to leave the Solent, another ship, the HMS Hawke, drew parallel with her. Olympic suddenly turned starboard and into the path of Hawke, and its captain could do nothing to stop it. He watched as Hawke's reinforced hull sliced into the Olympic, cutting through 2 of her watertight compartments. Violet never felt a thing amiss, but could only watch as the ship limped back into port for urgent repairs. Violet remained with the Olympic through the repairs and returned to service in November 1911. The Olympic had a further mishap in the Atlantic when she threw a propeller blade after hitting an unknown object, and for the second time, the Olympic was limped back to Belfast with Violet on board. It would have been the very last time the Olympic and her sister ship, the Titanic, would meet. On the 20th of March, Olympic would set sail again for Violet's last round trip to New York, before being one of a select few handpicked employees selected for the maiden voyage of the Titanic. She didn't want to go, but many of her friends saw this as a golden opportunity. We know that Violet boarded the Titanic on the 10th of April 1912, setting off from Southampton. Most likely she was on board early, ensuring her quarters were in order before helping with the first-class passengers. She liked her quarters. They were a vast improvement on her previous postings, and she admired the ship's designer Thomas Andrews for taking the crew's comments to heart. But what would she have been doing while on board? The role of a stewardess would have been mostly care of the passengers. As the passengers were split into classes, so would the stewardesses. Many of the first-class passengers would have brought their own valets and maids with them in order to tend to their individual needs, but the stewards and stewardesses would have ensured the rooms were clean and tidy, and that the customers and their servants had everything they needed. Violet had proven herself and was in the lavish section of the first-class stewardesses and would have tended to the rooms, made the beds, generally what you would expect in a standard hotel. There were roles specifically made for the stewardesses to complete. In the ladies-only areas of the ship, it was the stewardess that would tend to the needs of the passengers and that room as a whole. For example, the lady-only areas of the gym and the baths and the reading and writing rooms, while the stewards would likewise attend to the gentlemen's areas of the smoking rooms and the drawing rooms. After 4 uneventful and pleasant days at sea, Violet took in the crisp night air before retiring to her quarters for the night. It was cold, but nothing unusual for that time of year. She was slowly drifting off when the collision occurred. After realising something was wrong, the officers ordered all hands to helping passengers. Violet was ordered to the top deck, helping passengers and redirecting them to the boats. Her time abroad helped her, as her multilingual skills allowed her to speak to different people in their native tongue. The mood at first was calm, as many were more worried about clambering aboard the rickety lifeboats than staying aboard the sturdier liner. But as the Titanic began to slip under, the urgency increased. A ship's officer approached Violet and told her to get into lifeboat 16. Violet obeyed, but as she sat down, a baby was placed in her lap, with orders to look after it. Violet looked after the child and could only watch in horror as 1,500 souls slipped away forever. Amazingly, it appeared that the child's mother survived and was on board the Carpathia. The mother simply grabbed her child and disappeared into the ship. Violet never saw them again. Violet later arrived in New York and to mass hysteria. As with all crew that survived that night, Violet's place was stopped the moment the ship sank, but she had enough to get back to Southampton. She chose not to speak to the media, however. She knew that she had to get back on board again, otherwise she would lose her nerve. Facing this, she returned to the ship she felt the most comfortable, the Olympic. In 1914, the world changed with the outbreak of the First World War. The role of the stewardess was not required, so Violet decided to retrain to be a nurse. She qualified, and 2 years later she found herself on board the third of the 3 sisters, the Britannic. The Britannic was originally going to be called Gigantic. However, in the wake of the disaster, the name was changed to help bolster morale. The Britannic had undergone several changes. It was in the process of being outfitted as a passenger liner. However, the demands of war had the ship commandeered and refitted to be a hospital vessel to treat casualties of the war. To ensure the safety of the ship was painted white with red crosses on its side to signal its intention, as it was a 1907 universal ruling to never attack a medical vessel. But while in general it was considered a war crime to attack a hospital ship, sea mines don't discriminate. While the ship was heading to Greece to collect soldiers, the ship hit a deep sea mine. The explosion was dramatic and shockwaves were felt right around the ship. The crew got to work, Violet included, to get to the lifeboat, but the captain was determined to save the ship as best he could. Now, this next part does come with a bit of trigger warnings, so if you're not comfortable with graphic descriptions, you might want to skip the next couple of minutes. Thanks to the shockwaves disabling part of the steering, the captain ordered the port shaft screw propeller to be run faster than the starboard side, desperate to turn the ship closer to an island. He hoped that he could run the ship aground, saving all lives on board. Meanwhile, the passengers, including Violet, were waiting for the order to lower the lifeboats. The listing was causing worry amongst the members of the crew, and the Britannic was sinking faster than the Titanic. Some members of the crew got too scared and lowered their lifeboats without permission. This included lifeboat number 2, which Violet was in. The influx of water at the head and the listing, however, caused the portside screw propeller to sit proud of the water and caused the lowered lifeboats to be sucked towards it. Some people realised that they were being sucked into the fast-moving prop as soon as they hit the water, and they jumped out of the lifeboats, but the suction was too great. The lifeboats and the men had no chance, and they were shredded instantly by the spinning propeller. Violet jumped clear from number 2 into the water and escaped with her life, but she hit her head on the keel and sustained serious injuries. The captain ordered an all-stop, not knowing of the horror behind him, and ordered the remaining boats to be lowered, and Violet was picked up. But as soon as the last lifeboat was clear, the captain gave one last effort to get the ship to the island, but it was far too late. After one final death blast of a whistle, using the last of her steam, the captain stepped off the bridge and into the water, and all observed the second of the three sisters slip beneath the waves. Violet's head injuries were serious enough that she had to take several months to recover, but soon she was heading back to England. Violet didn't want to head out back to sea just yet, so she took up a job as a bank clerk to the end of the war. In 1920, though, the allure of the sea life was just too tempting, and once again she approached the White Star Line for a posting. For 30 more years she spent at sea, the life on the waves very different before the war. She was still a stewardess, but instead of looking after immigrants and the elite, she was looking after tourists and people coming just to cruise rather than just to get from A to B. In 1950, Violet took her last posting aboard RMS Andes before she hung up her sea legs for good. She retired to Suffolk and led a quiet retirement tending to a small holding where she spoke of her survival and wrote memoirs of her encounters. She passed in 1971, leaving a remarkable legacy. But was she the only one to survive the three sisters? Well, no. There was in fact another. Nicknamed the Unsinkable Stoker, Arthur Priest had just as much luck as Violet. Being a stoker is a demanding and dangerous job. The work is hot and it's hard. But even before Arthur had got on board the Olympic, he'd already survived one shipwreck, the RMS Astorius, who had, ironically, had a collision on her maiden voyage. He was on board the Olympic when she had her famous crash, was one of only a handful of stokers that managed to make their way to a lifeboat on the Titanic, and was on board the Britannic when she was hit, and he took one more as he survived the SS Donegal when it was torpedoed. Not much is known about his personal life, and he barely spoke about his life at sea. But he passed at just the age of 49, not of an incident, but of an illness on land. According to his wife, it was said that considering his reputation, no one wished to ever sail with him. Consider them the luckiest or unluckiest people to have ever lived. There is no doubt, considering they never let any disaster deter them to do their duty. They have to be some of the strongest people we've ever known.